Hey, what's up? This is Phoenix and welcome back to my channel. I encourage you to hit that like button, to share with your friends, and to subscribe. My goal for the year 2020 is to reach up to 200 subscribers, so hit that like button, subscribe and share, and let's make this year 2020 the best that it can possibly be. Now today, I'm going to read from my philosophical treatise, In Defense of the Mind. You can find this book and more on my author page at amazon.com/author/Phoenix_rises. I encourage you to check out the book, and just so you're aware, it's also available for download at a very cheap price. So I hope that you'll check it out. Now today, I'm going to read from my book In Defense of the Mind, and specifically the chapter title, A Theory of Mind, which is the first chapter in the book. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I hope you enjoy. A Theory of Mind. I am very intrigued by philosophy of mind and the emerging field of the philosophy of mental illness, or even what could be called the philosophy of psychiatry. I think the topic of mental illness overlaps significantly with the philosophy of mind. And for the first chapter of this book, I would like to focus on developing a theory of the mind that would hopefully probe what the mind is, what the mind can do, the philosophy of which is going to connect together into a deeper thesis regarding what I call a defense of the mind, broadly speaking. There are many theories of mind, as even a casual student of the philosophy of mind will know. I'm not even aware of all of the theories out there, and don't consider myself an expert on philosophy of mind, even though I have a pretty good grasp of many of the basic concepts in philosophy of mind, such as idealism, developed by George Berkeley, and Spinoza's idea of parallelism, or later theories formulated by Richard Rorty and Wittgenstein, John Searle, and Patricia Churchland. For my intents and purposes, the theory of mind that holds the most weight for me is what could be called dualistic existentialism, or existentialist dualism. I want to clarify these terms and get specific, but that is the basic idea. You've probably heard of Cartesian dualism, right? The idea that the mind is a separate entity from the physical world, or more specifically, the physical body, hence the name dualism. There is a physical body and there is an abstracted mind, dual properties that coexist. Dualism is often, in modern philosophy of mind, not the go-to theory of the mind, despite its influence on philosophy. There are too many problems with it, too much baggage. The approach often championed currently is functionalism. I think that functionalism has its uses, and it is a great theory of mind, one that functions, forgive the pun. But I think that dualism offers some very special possibilities as a result of it merely existing in the literature of philosophy of mind and existing as a thought. I think it carries crucial implications and meaning. Sure, there is what has been called the problem of interaction. How, if the mind and body are separate, does the mind interact with the body? As well as the problems associated with the metaphysics of Cartesian dualism, but again, I am going to adopt dualism nonetheless. I am going to adopt it because dualism, by placing so much emphasis on the mind as its own separate entity, allows us to look at the mind as a distinct specimen for further study, as something to see as its own thing. I think if you consider it carefully, you can intuitively grasp some of the benefits of abstracting the mind and separating it from the Western obsession with the physical world. See, it's the psychology of it, right? What would be the benefit of seeing the mind as something separate to study? There are many reasons I hope to explain in detail soon, but think about that question for yourself and why it would be helpful. Certainly seeing the mind as its own entity can be helpful because it allows for a person to see their mind as its own thing that is not just their brain, but the housing unit for their thoughts, desires, ideas, feelings, and the like. In short, it allows us to not just zero in on an important component of our existence, our mind, which effectively impacts our behavior, but also focus more exclusively on the mind. Essentially, the claim is that by allowing us to see the mind as something separate and indeed very distinct, and something that can be manipulated simply by virtue of our thoughts, well, it essentially implies that the agent can be accountable for their own mind because they can be aware of their own mind and all that it entails. And this is precisely where existentialism comes in. Existentialism is a complicated field of study, from thinkers ranging from Nietzsche to Sartre to Heidegger, from notions ranging from the will to power to authenticity, to the power of subjectivity, or the necessity of bad faith. And I think that these ideas are what make existentialism so appealing. We are, as Sartre would say, fully responsible for our nature and our choices. We are responsible for everything that we do. We are responsible for everything that we think. We are responsible for everything we desire. That I would call the more hard existentialist points, because there are some things we don't have control over. This is why I will specifically posit a more soft existentialism, but with the same basic claims. So, what are those claims? Without getting into too much detail, I do think that the mind is much more complicated than we give it credit for. It is hard to control all the gadgets that make our mind tick. It's hard to control every fleeting thought. Mental illness, I believe, can in the right context be a very crippling disease. That's hard for me to say when I champion the benefits of mental illness and not the actual illness aspects, but that's another story. But it can also be limiting and debilitating. This is why I propose a softer existentialism. We are in control, but only to an extent. Where do we draw the line is of course a valid and is the important question. There is obviously a major contrast and spectrum of saying that we are not in control because of chemicals in our brain and saying we are completely in control because of free will. Is the cold killer responsible for their actions? Is the thief responsible for their theft? Is the drug addict with clear impairment to the brain responsible for their decisions and addiction? I want to say yes all the way, but I do think it's a little more complicated than that. It isn't so black and white. That being said, I want to stick with as much existentialism as I possibly can when it comes to detailing my theory of dualistic existentialism. I want to say that despite mental illness, despite physical damage to the brain, despite misfiring neurotransmitters and the like, we are fully responsible for our thoughts. I want to say that despite genetics and built-in instincts, we control our thoughts. But, well, you probably figured out why there might be some problems with the hard existentialist viewpoint, particularly when it comes to the mind and the clear implications of neuroscience. The importance of existentialism in this idea of a dualistically existential viewpoint of the mind, however, is that not only can we see the mind as an entity for further study, to allow us to also further inquire into the nature of it, in accordance with Cartesian dualism and its emphasis of the mind as its own separate entity, but we can also be responsible for it. I cannot stress how important that it is, even if we fail or have biological problems, that we work to control every single one of our thoughts, feelings, desires, and the like. It is important that we be accountable and responsible for our minds. Our mind determines so much of our life, which is probably why it is shrouded in so much mystery. And I think that the more that we understand it, or the more we at least try to understand it, the more that we can accomplish. I know there are problems with an existential dualism when thinking specifically about the tradition in which this idea would fit in the field of study that is philosophy. First, there is already the opposition between both schools, existentialism and dualism, and their antagonists. So, for instance, a determinist or a materialist would see many problems with an existentialist view of mind. A monist or idealist would, naturally, see a problem with the dualistic view of the mind. All of that being said, let's examine the benefits of believing that our mind is not only free, the existentialist viewpoint, but also separate from any and all other considerations, due to Cartesian dualism. I've already implied the freedom with our thoughts and the freedom to study it, but probably the best way to formulate a benefit from this perspective is that we are agents that can study our own mind, and it means not only is this a possibility, but it's something we can do right now, this very moment. Now, of course, the catch is that the agent must be aware of this possibility. If the agent sincerely believes they are not in control of not just their choices in nature, but also their thoughts and desires, then they cannot employ dualistic existentialism. If they don't think their mind is something that can be studied internally and psychologically, the same problem arises. The ready-made apparatus that comes from the uniquely but conveniently combined concepts giving way to dualistic existentialism is that we get to control our minds. We have complete control. We have the opportunity, potentially at least, for complete understanding. How can this deep understanding of the mind be reached, achieved? I think reflection is crucial for this process. The benefits of self-reflection are insurmountable. So, for instance, what are we thinking right now? Are we aware of what we are thinking? What do we want right now? Are we aware of what we want right now? Are we aware of where our thoughts are going to go from this point on? Can we predict what is going to happen with our train of thought and where we'll end up soon enough? Whether that can be done or not conclusively is hard to say, but the program behind existential dualism is that we are certainly going to try. The mind has too much potential, and the good thing about self-consciousness, reached via some self-reflection, is that we are getting in touch with our deepest nature. It would seem to me that there is nothing really deeper in meaning than the human mind, apart from, if you're into metaphysics, spirituality, and even religion, the human heart and the human soul. And there is certainly a benefit from trying to study the mind. I am talking about psychology, but I'm also talking about more than just psychology. I know this is a common objection to my conception of the mind. Just look at the behaviorist. But essentially, what is the point of knowing all about physics, chemistry, and biology of the mind if we don't actually know what the mind is, what makes it tick, what it is thinking, and why it is thinking, etc.? I propose that there are few things more important than understanding or trying to understand the human psyche. No wonder Freud was so arrogant. He had to believe he'd figured out the mind, because otherwise he'd have to admit how completely unpredictable the mind is. Because when it comes to human behavior and the mind, certainly it's difficult to take a deterministic perspective, and even in terms of the mysterious nature of the mind, it's hard to take a materialist stance. Can it all really be reduced to the physical realm? I'm not so sure, despite the evidence, and even if it can all be reduced to the physical realm, what good is it to know this, knowing of which is itself a kind of abstraction in the abstract mind? The theory of dualistic existentialism, however, isn't a theory of mind meant to be conclusive. Nothing is ever conclusive, of course, not even in science, which is why we have philosophy of science. Who really understands their own mind, much less the mind of anyone else? Rather, the theory is proposed as a means for narrowing in on the powers of the mind, the potential of the mind, to defend it from certain naysayers, and essentially give it back control to our conception of mind. We've gotten too carried away by materialism and determinism and the like, and have moved away from trying to understand the mind as something that we are in control of, or at least could potentially be in control of. As a side note, I think that is what can be appreciated about Eastern philosophy and their emphasis on meditation, and trying to get in touch with the mind or understand it, or even empty it. I don't deny that the mind is complex, and I don't want to pin it down, though I don't think that's possible, but I do want to study it, and I do want to be responsible for it, at least as much as I can. So, what do you think about this concept of dualistic existentialism and how it relates to the mind? I have hit upon some of the objections already. I definitely don't promote the idea that the mind is just existentially dualistic. I don't want to overly categorize the mind as much as I like Aristotle. I think he worked too hard to categorize existence. But I do want to give us a specific way of viewing the mind that might give us more freedom and even more purpose for the reasons I've iterated. Because we can study it via methods like self-reflection, and because we focus exclusively on the mind. And we can be accountable for it via the philosophies of existentialism. Just remember, you would have to be aware that you are an active agent and participant in everything that you think, feel, and be. Without being aware of it, your brain is free to do whatever it wants. In that sense, the materialist would win. Just let the brain chemistry decide all your decisions and live life that way. Even if this theory of the mind is wrong, it still gives us a starting point for viewing the mind. It still gives us a place to go. And if it is right, I have simply stated a theory that will help us focus on the powers of the mind and defend it from the naysayers, those who want to crush the potential of our minds. Anyway, that was the first chapter from my philosophical treatise in defense of the mind. I hope that you'll check it out, and I hope that you enjoy it. There will be more to come, so keep a lookout, and I appreciate you viewing. So yeah, thank you for watching. This is Phoenix, and see you next time.